to Lodha & Co ESG Practice Podcast, where we will delve into the world of sustainable and responsible business practices. I'm your host for today, Anuradha Menon, and in today's episode, we are going to explore the topic of recent changes made by the Securities and Exchange Board of India (SEBI) in the environmental, social, and governance (ESG) domain. It is interesting to note how the Indian ESG regulations are taking shape, starting with the Business Responsibility Report (BRR), which was to be filed by the top 500 listed companies, which was then replaced by the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report (BRSR), which is to be filed by the top 1,000 listed companies. And now, as you know, we have the latest SEBI mandate for BRSR assurance and value chain disclosures. To help us today navigate this crucial subject, we have with us Ms. Simone Rathod, a company secretary by profession and a consultant with Lodha & Co ESG practice. To start off, Simone, can you tell us what are the intentions behind the ESG regulations coming into the picture?
Yes, so ESG regulations all over the world are on the rise now. And this is mainly because the regulators have realized that investors and other stakeholders are now not only concerned about the company's profit making ability, but also its ability to deal with environmental and social issues at the same time. And apart from this, there are n number of environmental and social risks that are as material as financial risks, which can threaten the existence of the company or disrupt its business practices. For example, risk of climate change. Now, recently, the United Nations headquarters declared that the era of global warming has ended and the global boiling has started, which means we can expect flash floods, drought conditions, forest fires more than ever. Hence, globally, the governments, regulators are now focusing on sustainability and ensuring responsible business practices. In India too, in the year 2021, SEBI mandated the top 1,000 listed entities to report their sustainability performance in the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report. The report of the performance was against the 9 principles of National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct, and these guidelines were issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs.
That was very informative, Simone. Would you like to elaborate on the BRSR reporting?
Sure. So this report is divided into 3 sections. The first section seeks general information about the company, its business operations, and the material ESG risks and opportunities identified by the company. The second section seeks disclosure with respect to the governance and management structure that is laid down to manage and address the environmental and social risks and opportunities identified by the company. And the third section is further divided into essential and leadership indicators, where the disclosure on essential indicators is mandatory and disclosure on leadership indicators is voluntary. Now the third section seeks disclosure on the performance against the 9 principles of the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct.
I'm curious to know what made SEBI bring BRSR assurance into the picture. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so the whole idea of introducing the BRSR was to make companies responsible for their actions. But later on, it was found that companies did not have the right kind of policies and procedures in place. Some companies were using ESG reporting as a marketing tool and ended up greenwashing. And on the other hand, the credit rating agencies and investors were relying on this information and taking their investment decisions, which were obviously misleading. So thereby, SEBI decided to set up an ESG advisory committee where they discussed the need for verification of the ESG information reported in the BRSR. So the committee, after discussion, recommended that conducting an in-depth level of assurance of the entire BRSR report would be a costly exercise for the companies. So they came up with a limited set of indicators known as the BRSR core, since the whole idea was to improve the credibility and reduce the cost burden.
Thank you for clarifying. However, there is a lot of confusion going around on what is BRSR and BRSR code. Would you like to clarify this confusion?
So basically, the BRSR code is nothing but those indicators of the BRSR report which are to be assured by a third party assurance provider. So the BRSR code is actually the subset of the entire BRSR report. It is nothing but those indicators which are already mentioned in the BRSR report and which are to be reasonably assured by the third party assurance provider. So there are 9 key performance indicators that have been incorporated under each environment, social and governance area.
I am keen to understand what are these key performance indicators that have been added.
Sure. So I think the key performance indicators basically consist of quantifiable metrics that indicate sustainable outcomes in companies, and they are relevant to both manufacturing and service sectors. And what SEBI has done is, for global comparability, they have mentioned intensity ratios which are based on economic value adjusted for purchasing power parity. And the nine areas under which the KPIs have been mentioned are as follows: the greenhouse gas footprint, water footprint, energy footprint, embracing circularity, details related to waste management by the entity, enhancing employee well-being and safety, enabling gender diversity in business, enabling inclusive development, fairness in engaging with customers and suppliers, openness of business. So what SEBI has done is, SEBI has integrated these 9 core parameters in the BRSR format and has revised the earlier format of the BRSR report. So now the top 1000 listed entities have to report their ESG information with respect to the new format that has been introduced. So I'll just give you a brief idea of the new format that has been introduced, of BRSR report that has been introduced. So in section A, apart from the general disclosure which I had mentioned earlier, entities have to mention the name of the assurance provider and the type of assurance that has been obtained. In section B, there have been no changes that have been mentioned. In section C, in principle wise performance, so these principles related to the national guidelines on responsible business conduct, and in principle 1, which relates to ethics, transparency and accountability, the information that is sought is with respect to the number of days accounts payables and details of the concentration of the purchases and sales with trading houses, dealers and related parties. In principle 2, no further information is sought. In principle 3, which relates to well-being of employees, entities have to mention the cost that is incurred on well-being measures undertaken, which will form as a percentage of the total revenue of the company. In principle 4, no changes have been made. In principle 5, which relates to human rights, entities have to mention the gross wages that is paid to females as a percentage of total wages, and the number of complaints that is filed under Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, which includes details of complaints on POSH as a percentage of female employees or workers. Principle 6, which relates to taking care of the environment, there is a lot of information which has been sought, and all of this information relates to the greenhouse gas footprint, water footprint, energy footprint, embracing circularity, that is waste management by the entity. Principle 7, which relates to public policy, there is no such changes made. Principle 8, which relates to inclusive development, here the more information is sought with respect to the percentage of input material that is directly sourced from suppliers within India, and information with respect to job creation in smaller towns where companies have to disclose the wages paid as a percentage of total wage cost in rural, semi-urban, urban and metropolitan areas. In principle 9, which is with respect to taking care of the consumers and being fair to them, the information that is sought from the company is number of instances of data breaches, the percentage of data breaches involving personally identifiable information of customers, and the impact if there is any data breach that has taken place within the company.
Since ESG assurance is still a new concept, can you explain the difference between reasonable assurance and limited assurance? I believe a lot of confusion will be there around this subject.
So, assurance is basically a cross check or a verification of the information that is mentioned in the report, the BRSR report. Now, there are two levels of assurance, which is one is limited assurance, which is in the form of a review of the data that is mentioned in the report. A few tests are conducted to ensure its credibility, whereas the other type is reasonable assurance, which is in the form of an examination of any kind of material risk that is associated to the information that is reported. So the auditor usually assesses the adequacy of the internal control and processes when it comes to reasonable assurance, and hence SEBI also opted for reasonable assurance, which is an in-depth level of assurance, and it can help to reduce the risk that is associated with respect to the information that is reported in the BRSR report. Now, what is more interesting is even the value chain partners are now brought into the ambit of sustainability reporting.
What are value chain disclosures?
So, first I would like to throw some light on what are value chain partners. So, value chain partners are those entities that basically convert your input into output by adding value to the products or services of the company. For example, raw material suppliers, service providers, etc. Now, the reason why they have introduced ESG disclosures for value chain partners is because a number of companies have a significant ESG footprint in the value chain. So this will enable the investors and the stakeholders to get a complete picture of the ESG risk and the impact that is associated with them. But now the interesting twist is the onus is on the listed entities to report on the core KPIs of the value chain report partners. And this information has to be assured by a third party, and the type of assurance that is required to be taken is limited assurance. So at present, SEBI has mandated top 250 listed companies in the financial year 24-25 to report on the ESG disclosures of the value chain partners as a part of their annual report. Now, companies are also given this liberty to report the information of upstream and downstream partners together, or separately prepare a report for the upstream value chain partners and the downstream value chain partners. Now, not all the value chain partners are covered in the ambit. So they have said that those value chain partners that contribute to the 75% of the entity's sales or purchase value, only those value chain partners will be covered for reporting and assurance. So the reporting has to be done on the BRSR core KPIs, which we discussed earlier, that is those 9 core KPI indicators which have been integrated in the BRSR report, and the related information disclosure that the companies have to give. So this is pretty much regarding the value disclosures for value chain.
That was very informative, Simone. Recently, I came across an article posted by Economic Times which stated that with the introduction of BRSR core for assurance and value chain disclosures, companies have to bear the burden of compliance, which involves huge costs. What is your take on this?
Yeah, it does involve some kind of expenditure that needs to be done to set up an internal control, to have the required management, to have the required tool. But some experts also believe that the cost incurred should be viewed as an investment, as there are a lot of positive returns also in terms of investor confidence, generation of capital, because nowadays banks and investors, they are also willing to fund those companies who follow the best ESG practices. And if the company follows these practices, It will ensure the well-being of the employees. So the employees in turn will feel safe, and this will increase their productivity. The company will also enjoy good reputation in the market. So in the short term, yes, the companies will face some kind of cost burden, no doubt. But in the long run, this will help the companies to mitigate the material risks that are associated with the environmental, social and governance factors, and thereby create a value for the organization.
So to conclude for today, would you like to share going forward how the companies need to prepare for assurance and value chain disclosures?
So most of the Indian companies at present are in their preparatory stage of reporting. So first of all, companies will have to ensure that all their policies, practices, procedures are in place. Their internal control processes are robust and are in place and are in operation on a day-to-day basis. What they can do is they can also conduct a gap analysis assessment where they can benchmark their practices with their peers, identify the gaps and work on the policies and procedures if any kind of updation is required. Now, based on my discussion with various listed entities, I have found that data collection from across various departments is one of the major challenge which these companies face. For that also, what companies can do is they can have a software tool which they can integrate with their overall risk management, and thereby it will smoothen the process of data collection and collation. Now, this is the first year of reporting and assurance. So companies can also go for a preliminary internal audit. They can hire a third party and get an internal audit done and identify the gaps and identify areas where they need to improve themselves, and thereby address the challenges and thereby go ahead with it. Another point that I want the companies to focus on is maintaining a sufficient and appropriate audit trail of all the data that is entered in the ESG reports, because if you don't have a sufficient and appropriate audit trail, then the auditors will not be able to verify this information, and then there could be a lot of challenges ahead. So these are pretty much the points where the companies will have to focus on.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you all for giving us your time today. We hope you found this episode insightful. Stay tuned for getting more insights in the ESG domain. Thank you.